Minister, I welcome your government's proposal to expand the spending limit to €500 million to the tourism sector before year-end, and I can promise you it is extremely badly needed. In your opening address, you highlighted that tourism as being Ireland's most important indigenous and labour-intensive sector, generating substantial export earnings and tax revenues, and nobody would disagree with that statement. You also spoke of its importance being woven into the fabric of our Irish cultural and social life and the critical role it plays to regional economies. And again, no disagreement there. And you spoke of the multiplier effect to the agricultural, to the service and to the indigenous sector in terms of hospitality and beverage and entertainment and all of that. So you've rightly identified, Minister, this is a very, very important sector in the country, but I would go as far as to say it's probably one of the most important in the regions of the country, who do not have the economies of scale that you have in the large cities, and therefore we have a lot of people around, particularly the rural parts of Ireland, who absolutely depend on some of the revenue that comes from tourism. And it's interesting the way Ireland has changed over the last 30, 40 years. I can certainly remember as a youngster, Killarney and Galway were littered with bed and breakfast, very few hotels, and everybody who went on holidays, by and large, did so by bed and breakfast. We've had quite a big turnaround in that sector in recent years, and we now have quite a lot of hotels, but not in all parts of the country. And there's also a real offering now for a different type of holidays. I know you mentioned the idea of experiential holidays, and that is the way a lot of tourism seems to be going, and certainly Ireland can do well in that sector if we have the right product, but we have to be able to tailor it to people's needs and to their pockets. I just speak about my own city and county for the minute, Waterford, the oldest city in the country, the founding city in the country. It has had more American visitors we've had in Waterford this year than we've had Irish visitors to the city, and that's a first in any tourism year. We have seen the return of luxury liners to Dunmore East, which is very, very welcome. But it has to be noted that we were restricted in the number of liners that we could bring in because the harbour master would only allow a certain number. And I think that's something that your department needs to talk to the Department of Ag and Marine next year about, because we can't have a repeat of that. We had business there coming from liners that couldn't actually dock off Dunmore East. And it's a great experience for all involved, and it's very, very needed for the area. We have 5 top-class museums in Waterford, Minister, and actually 2 new additions in the last 2 years. The Silver Museum and the Museum of Time, which is now a standout world-class and recognised so as a museum. And we also have the Waterford Museum of Treasures. And this again will have its busiest year ever this year. What's amazing about this group of museums ministers, they charge admission to people coming through the door. I can leave the house here tonight and I can go into the National Museum next door for free. But I can't go into any of my museums in Waterford for free. I have to pay. And that is a serious inequity for the likes of the Museum of Treasures in Waterford. Why are we funding attractions around the country and not putting funding into that to support that? Because it is difficult. If you're coming down there, you're buying a ticket, and most people don't buy a ticket for all 5. They buy 1 or maybe 2 together because it's too expensive, even though they might like to see. So I think we are losing out there. Beyond that, we have a great festival culture down in Waterford as well, you know, Minister. I know you were down at Spree last year. We have Winterville coming up at Christmas time. We have the West Waterford Festival of Food Harvest. So we have people who are absolutely clued in to offering indigenous and foreign tourist appeal in our city and county. But again, we do need support. And I thank you this year, and I know that Spree pointed out that certainly there was funding, I think extra funding given last year during COVID. But again, we don't do that well in the funding stakes overall. And I know it's often, I was on council for a year, I know it is difficult for the local authority to find funding. And I would ask you to look at that, particularly this year coming, which is going to be very hard on the total retail and tourism sector. We have 5 blue flag beaches in the county, and they are top class in every way. But Minister, I'm involved in an initiative to try and bring beach wheelchairs onto some of those blue flag beaches. These are wheelchairs that would run on the beach for disabled people. and disabled people who are wheelchair bound cannot get onto the beach because their wheelchair wheels are too narrow to go along the sand, and they certainly can't get near the water. And that's what these chairs would appeal. But as well as that, I would ask you, if there's funding going around, Tramore, which is one of the largest beaches in Waterford and one of the busiest, absolutely needs a disability changing room. We need a hoist in there, and we need to be able to offer ourselves as an inclusive town and city and resort, that people can come down in a wheelchair, that they can be hoisted if they need to be, and that they can be changed if they need be, because otherwise they cannot come. And there's a significant amount of people for whom the sea experience and the seaside experience is not available to them. And I would ask you, I know it's been brought up again at Council before, and funding is always the issue, as it always is. But this is not big money, Minister, in the scheme of things. I would ask you to look at that, please. Beyond that, I would also speak about the marketing of Waterford, and I've had a problem historically. I'm not a fan of Ireland's ancient East, I'll be straight with you. I always thought we should have been brought into the Wild Atlantic Way, and we weren't. But we do have the Copper Coast, which is a standout area of special conservation in Waterford. And I have a concern, Minister, about our policy in terms of wind generation off the south coast of Ireland. And we are presently surveying for 3 separate wind farms, all off the south coast of Waterford and East Cork. And there's a briefing later this week, I believe, in the AV room from ESB. And in ESB's prompt, they tell us that they'll have wind pylons 12 kilometres from shore, which is approximately 6 to 7 miles, 350 metres high, Minister, an array of 60 to 70 per field. So I would just ask you now, Minister, to have a long, hard look at this wind policy before you start to put a plethora of it down on one of the most scenic parts of the country. We are certainly prepared to do our bit down in Waterford to support the national energy crisis and to support sustainable energy, but not at the cost of our amenities. And what I would ask you, 2 things about wind energy, as you are a senior minister in the Green Party. One is, what is the community dividend going to be exactly to all the coastal communities for each of these 3 wind farms, Ministers? And I have met some of the promoters involved, and I understand the community dividend is payable over 15 years. Yet the life of these licences will be 25 years, and the life of these farms will be 50 years. So I would ask you to have a look at this, Minister. And secondly, can I ask you, are you considering putting a ratchet in place for 2 things? One, that we would understand what price the Irish people will pay for our indigenous wind generation when we get it, as opposed to what we'll export it for. And secondly, that government could at any time, if they wished, step in at a known formula and take ownership and nationalise that wind infrastructure if required. Because if we're not doing that, I think we need to hold off on awarding any of these licences until we review this. Because I have a very strong concern that we are going to end up with a Corrib-type situation as regards wind in Ireland, and particularly wind off the south coast. We'll be left looking at the windmills, blotting our landscape. We'll be paying more for the energy, and we'll be getting very, very little by way of recompense for all of that. So I would ask you, please, Minister, to take that to the Climate Minister. Beyond that, our nighttime economy is an absolute terrible order at the moment, and we need supports for business. The energy situation is critical, but beyond that, staff and retention is very, very difficult. But overall, we are probably heading into a recession. And Minister, we cannot have the vibrant cultural tourism offering that you spoke about in your opening address if we do not have private people in business able to stay in business. And I've seen in recent weeks revenue is getting very, very tough on people in the service and hospitality sector in terms of monies that they owe and the demand letters and the rising rates and all of that. So we cannot have talk in the House of how we're going to help sectors unless we're actually going to put money on the ground to support business and to support staffing. So I'd please ask you to look at that. And one more area, and I know, and I've been involved in trying to help government here, is the insurance sector. And I know we have legislation hopefully coming for occupiers' liability, and the reform of PIA will pass before the end of the year. But Minister, we still need significant pressure from government. We have a lot of children's activities, and particularly bouncy castle operators now finished. People with climbing frames finished in terms of business because they cannot get insurance. And how are we to attract families and small children as a tourist offering if we cannot allow them to play safely because we don't have adequate cover in place, or we haven't regulated the courts enough to make sure they're not giving these exceptional damages for very light injuries? But on the first point, Minister, I support the additional monies. I hope to see it, I would say, allocated fairly, and I hope to see it allocated in ways, Minister, speaking to the stakeholders in the tourism sector, who will tell you how best it can be spent and where it will have the most effect.